Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we grab the sources you've shared and really dig into the core ideas, the surprising facts and insights.
And today, we are digging into something pretty provocative.
We are. The source material for this deep dive comes from excerpts of a book called Practical Anarchy, which is the second in a 3-volume series.
Right. And it makes this huge claim, doesn't it?
An incredibly ambitious claim that it's actually identified how to end violence, injustice, and, well, brutal control in society. That's massive.
It really is. The author lays out this comprehensive framework for what they call a stateless society, arguing this is the key.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty straightforward then. We're going to unpack the core arguments, the examples, basically everything presented in these excerpts.
We want to understand the framework being proposed.
Exactly. And look, we know these are radical claims, so we want to be clear we're exploring them impartially, just looking at what the source material actually says.
Let's dive in. So the book starts by tackling what anarchy even means, because it's often misunderstood.
Right. It's not chaos, according to the source. Not at all.
No. The author defines it as basically the consistent application of one single moral idea that initiating force is wrong.
So, starting violence, using force first, that's the baseline wrong.
Exactly. And from that starting point, the argument develops that government, the state, is inherently immoral.
Why? How does that follow?
Well, because the state, almost by definition, claims the exclusive right to initiate violence against its own citizens.
Okay, like with taxation. You don't really offer to pay taxes. There's a threat of force behind it if you don't comply.
Right. Or regulations, they're enforced ultimately by fines, penalties, maybe even jail time. Force is always the backstop.
So the source sees this claim by the state, this monopoly on initiating force, as the fundamental problem.
Yes. And it poses this challenge, asking if it's logical to say reducing state violence is good, but getting rid of it completely is somehow bad or immoral.
Yeah, that seems like a contradiction they're pointing out, like saying half curing a disease is great, but fully curing it is dangerous.
Exactly. If initiating force is wrong, the argument goes, then the logical conclusion is to eliminate it wherever you find it, and that includes the force used by the state.
Okay. So that naturally leads into a critique of why the state exists or the justifications given for it.
Right. And one big critique is about how governments claim they need power and money to solve huge problems like poverty. The source argues these claims often act as, well, pretexts, justifications for raising taxes and grabbing more power.
They use that analogy, right, about the iPod.
Yeah, like someone promises you an iPod if you give them money, you pay, but no iPod appears. They ask for more money, still promising the iPod.
And eventually you realize the promise was just a way to get the money, not actually about delivering the iPod.
Exactly. So the source suggests governments say, give us more taxes to fix poverty, but according to the author, poverty persists, taxes go up, and the real outcome is just a bigger state.
And they also point to practical failures, don't they? Like the state-run system's not actually working well.
Yeah, things like public education or social agencies. The source argues they often fail to meet their own stated goals, citing some pretty grim statistics about educational outcomes for poor kids as evidence.
Now, whenever you talk about such fundamental change, like getting rid of the state, there's bound to be fear. The source has a name for this reaction.
Yeah, the AFA, the argument from apocalypse.
Or, as they put it more colorfully, the we're all gonna die objection.
Right. Yes. But the point the author makes is that this reaction, this fear, isn't actually a logical argument against the idea itself.
It's just fear of the unknown or fear of the consequences.
Oh, right. The source argues you shouldn't judge if an idea is true or morally right based only on whether you're scared of what might happen if it were implemented.
They bring up historical parallels, like people being terrified of, disproving God or basing ethics on reason, or even radical new scientific ideas.
Exactly. The fear was real in those cases too, but it didn't mean the underlying ideas were wrong. It's about separating the idea's validity from the emotional reaction.
Okay, so a big part of the alternative vision relies on contrasting the state relationship with voluntary interactions, like in a free market.
Yes, this is crucial. The state relationship is described as fundamentally one-sided, dictatorial even.
Edicts come down, laws are made, taxes are levied, and you don't negotiate. You comply or face consequences.
Consequences enforced by violence, ultimately. Losing your house, your freedom. Compare that, the source says, to dealing with a private business like your cable company.
Right. If they hike prices or the service is terrible, you've got options.
You can call them, try to negotiate, switch to a competitor, or just, cancel the service entirely. It's a two-way street. They need your business.
You can't really fire the government if you disagree with its tax policy.
No, and the source suggests thinking about it from the other side of the negotiation table. How would providers behave if they constantly had to earn your trust and your business voluntarily?
Which the state, by its nature, doesn't have to do in the same way.
Precisely. And this idea of voluntary interaction is the bedrock for all the sources' proposals about how a society could function without a state.
Okay, let's get into those proposals. The big one first. Defense. How does a stateless society defend itself from, say, foreign invasion?
Well, the core argument here is kind of surprising. The source claims a truly stateless society is inherently difficult, maybe even impossible, to invade successfully.
How so?
Because there's no central government to defeat, no capital city to capture, no centralized tax system to take over and exploit. What's the goal for the invader? What do they actually get?
I like that analogy they use. The chickens versus the seagulls.
Exactly. Invading a statist nation is like raiding a chicken coop. The chickens are penned up, a concentrated target, easy to control.
Whereas trying to conquer a stateless society is like trying to conquer a flock of seagulls. They just scatter. There's nothing cohesive to grab onto.
Right. The source also mentions things like deactivated money to further reduce any material spoils an invader might hope to seize.
But the source also makes a pretty controversial point about existing governments in defense, suggesting they might actually cause some of the threats they claim to protect us from.
Yes, the argument is that powerful states use taxpayer money for things like foreign military bases or interventions. And these actions, the source claims, can create resentment, enemies, and provoke attacks.
They specifically cite the example of U.S. military presence in the Middle East as a potential provocation for attacks like 9/11.
The idea is that the state's ability to fund large-scale military operations through involuntary taxation is what enables these potentially provocative actions and the resulting blowback.
That's a really strong claim in the book. Does the source elaborate much on the balance between genuine protection and provocation?
In these excerpts, the main focus is that the mechanism itself, state power funded by taxes allowing for large-scale war-making, creates the risk. It puts citizens in harm's way as a consequence of state actions abroad.
Okay. And the source then asks you to think about where your actual security comes from day to day.
Right. Which sector protects you more effectively? Is it the public police and military, or is it the private security measures you might already use? Alarms, locks, maybe private guards or gated communities?
Comparing voluntary, privately funded security, where effectiveness is maybe more directly tied to payment, versus public systems that can be seen as, well, sometimes slow or inefficient despite costing a lot in taxes.
Exactly. So, moving beyond defense, how do you handle disputes? Enforce contracts. Deal with crime without state courts or police. This is where DROs and CRAs come in.
Okay, DROs, dispute resolution organizations. And CRAs, credit reporting agencies. Tell me more.
Yeah, think of them as private voluntary alternatives. DROs would be like private arbitration services, mediators, contract enforcers. CRAs would be like supercharged credit bureaus, tracking reliability.
And people would voluntarily contract with these.
That's the idea. They'd work together. For instance, you could get contract insurance from your DRO.
How would that work?
Let's say you're making a big deal with someone. You pay your DRO a small fee to insure the contract. The DRO assesses the risk, probably using the other person's rating from interconnected CRAs.
Okay.
If the other person defaults, your DRO pays you the insured amount. Then that person owes the debt to the DRO or its insurer, and their CRA rating takes a major hit if they don't pay up.
So your reputation, your rating within this network of CRAs and DROs becomes incredibly important. It's like your social and economic collateral.
Exactly. A good rating means lower insurance costs, people trust you, businesses want to deal with you. A bad rating, well, that leads to what the source calls economic ostracism.
Economic ostracism. That sounds serious. How would that actually work to compel payment or restitution, especially for something like a violent crime?
So if someone defaults on a debt, whether it's a contract debt or, say, restitution ordered by a DRO for harming someone and they refuse to pay, their rating collapses across the whole network.
And because most businesses, landlords, service providers would likely rely on this system for trustworthy interactions,
that person could find it incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to rent an apartment, get a loan, buy insurance, perhaps even access basic services from anyone plugged into the system.
So not prison enforced by the state, but exclusion enforced by the network based on refusal to meet obligations.
That's the proposed mechanism. The source uses the example of someone found responsible for a violent crime, like rape, by a DRO. They'd be assigned a large restitution debt to the victim.
If they don't pay.
Economic ostracism kicks in. They aren't jailed by a state, but they're effectively cut off from normal economic life until they make things right.
Okay, I can see how that might work for debts. But how does a DRO determine the debt for something like rape? Assigning a monetary value seems incredibly difficult.
That's a fair point, and these excerpts don't detail the exact valuation methods. The principle presented, though, is that some form of restitution debt would be assigned by the voluntary adjudicators. The key mechanism is that failure to pay that debt triggers the ostracism managed by the interconnected DRO-Carré network, not by state police. The goal is making non-cooperation extremely costly, socially and economically.
And the source argues this system makes calculated crimes of motive, like theft, much less attractive than just working honestly.
Right, because the potential downside, total economic exclusion, is so severe compared to the potential gain. Crimes of passion are different, obviously less about calculation, but for planned crime, the economic risk-reward changes dramatically, according to the source.
Okay, what about those classic public goods problems like pollution or roads? These always come up.
Definitely. On pollution, the source actually critiques the state's record, pointing out that state-owned land is often highly polluted and that governments sometimes protected polluters from lawsuits by property owners.
So what's the stateless solution proposed?
It relies heavily on strong private property rights. If a factory pollutes your land or air, you have a direct claim for damages against them, pursued through your DRO.
And the argument is that DROs and insurers would actually have an incentive to prevent pollution.
Yeah, because preventing pollution damage is ultimately cheaper for them than constantly paying out claims for damages. The economic incentive aligns with environmental protection, or so the argument goes.
Interesting. Okay, now, roads, the classic. Who will build the roads? No toll booths everywhere, you said.
Thankfully, no. The source suggests funding would primarily come from those who benefit most directly from road access, developers.
Developers, like people building housing estates or shopping malls.
Exactly. They need good roads to make their developments valuable and accessible. So the source argues they would fund and maintain the necessary roads as part of the cost of their project. It's in their direct financial interest.
So the cost gets bundled into the price of houses or goods sold at the mall, rather than paid via direct tolls or gas taxes.
That's the core idea. Drivers would still pay, indirectly, for the convenience, safety, and access roads provide, maybe through property values, maybe subscriptions, maybe linked to insurance.
But what about monopolies? Couldn't one company buy up all the roads in an area and charge outrageous prices? Like that Jacques example in the book.
The source argues true monopolies are hard to sustain voluntarily. People have alternatives. Maybe not a parallel road right next door, but different routes entirely. Different transport modes, trains, buses, bikes, or even choosing different destinations or activities.
And the economic ostracism factor comes in again.
Potentially, yes. If a road owner gouges excessively, customers might boycott, and other businesses in the DO-Korea network might refuse to deal with them. Plus, you'd likely have auto insurers pushing for road safety and quality, maybe charging higher premiums for using bad roads, creating another market pressure.
Okay. Shifting gears again, healthcare. Another huge area currently dominated by state influence. What's the critique here?
The source argues the current system often gets incentives wrong. It subsidizes sickness, pays doctors per procedure rather than for successful outcomes, limits consumer information on doctor quality, and ends up creating a sort of hidden tiered system anyway.
And the proposed alternative in this stateless model?
It centers on private insurance, but with the argument that competition would align incentives correctly.
How so?
Insurers would profit most by keeping their customers healthy. Prevention is cheaper than cure. So they'd compete by offering plans that genuinely improve health outcomes, encouraging preventative care, sharing data on effective treatments, maybe even rewarding healthy lifestyles.
So your insurer becomes more like a partner in your health, because keeping you healthy is good for their bottom line.
That's the theory presented. Now, child protection, obviously a very sensitive topic. The source criticizes the current state systems here, too.
Claiming things like the welfare state or the drug war actually harm children and families, and that state agencies are often ineffective.
Yes. And the proposed solution, again, relies on direct responsibility and economic incentives.
How would that work for protecting children?
The core idea suggested is making parents directly financially liable through the DRO system for any damage their minor children cause.
So if your kid breaks a neighbor's window, you owe restitution via your DRO, and it hits your rating if you don't pay.
Correct. This creates, the source argues, a powerful financial reason for parents to supervise, teach, and raise their children responsibly.
And there might be positive incentives too, like lower insurance rates for taking parenting classes.
Exactly. Voluntary proactive measures encouraged by economic benefits. The source uses that fable of the sun and the wind here.
Ah, right. The wind tries to force the man's coat off with coercion, but he just clutches it tighter.
But the sun, with its gentle warmth representing voluntary incentives, makes the man want to take the coat off himself, a metaphor for state force versus voluntary cooperation.
That makes sense as an illustration.
Yeah.
What about laws against things the source calls voluntary crimes? Things like drug use, maybe prostitution.
The argument here is that these activities are often banned not because they inherently harm unwilling victims, but because of external moral judgments, what the author terms Puritanism.
And the source suggests that if the people pushing for these bans had to directly pay the costs of enforcement, like getting a bill for police raids or prosecutions,
Their enthusiasm for prohibition might decrease significantly. In a voluntary system, communities could set rules, but if they became too restrictive, people could just choose to leave and associate elsewhere. Enforcement relies on voluntary association, not state violence.
Okay, but what about the really big fear? Wouldn't a stateless society just collapse into rule by the strongest? Warlords, private armies, stateless dictatorships?
This is a major objection, and the source addresses it mainly through economics and risk. Raising a private army for conquest is incredibly expensive and risky without state backing.
How so? What are the risks?
Well, who would fund such a venture? Investors and banks would be wary of backing a force built on theft because that force could easily steal from them. They'd face competition from defensive DROs protecting clients. They'd face resistance. Their own troops might defect if not paid well voluntarily.
But the biggest factor, according to the source,
Funding. Sustaining a large, coercive army historically relies on taxes forcing everyone to pay. Without that mechanism, the source argues, it's extremely difficult, maybe impossible, to maintain such a force long-term purely through voluntary means or plunder.
so the lack of a tax base is the key barrier to large-scale private warfare. What about just simple aggression like the tank in the garden problem? Someone just takes your land by force.
The source frames this as a straightforward property rights violation. That's precisely what people would contract with defense DROs to prevent or resolve. Your defense provider would be obligated to remove the trespasser using necessary defensive force, just like you'd expect security or police to act now, but within a voluntary contract.
Okay. Last big area, money. The source is critical of the state monopoly on currency.
Yes. The argument is that giving the state control over money inevitably leads to things like inflation printing money to cover spending, which devalues everyone else's savings. It's seen as a form of hidden taxation or predation.
And the alternative is multiple private currencies.
That's a proposal. Competition between private currency providers would drive them to offer stable, secure, easy-to-use money. You might see different types emerge, maybe local currencies, digital ones, all competing based on reliability and features.
But couldn't a private currency just collapse? Wouldn't that be chaos?
The source argues that market mechanisms handle failure better than a state monopoly does. If one private currency starts to fail, people can shift to others. There are alternatives.
And mechanisms like audits or maybe stronger companies buying out weaker ones would manage the process.
Right. Think independent audits. Maybe lifeboat companies ready to take over distressed currencies. Plus, people would likely diversify anyway. Compare that to a state currency collapsing, everyone using it is affected, often with no immediate alternative. The source sees the competitive environment as more resilient.
Beyond all these societal structures, the author includes some personal reflections, right, about the value of thinking about these ideas.
Yeah, there's a candid part where the author talks about the personal side, acknowledging that holding such unconventional views can sometimes be isolating, straining relationships, but also emphasizing the deep satisfaction and intellectual reward of pursuing truth as you see it.
And there's that point about how the statist model can feel demeaning, like being treated as a disobedient pet whose compliance is assumed rather than a valued individual whose consent matters.
Exactly. The source suggests that really digging into anarchist philosophy encourages you to see all relationships, personal, business, societal, as ideally being two-sided negotiations, based on mutual value and voluntary agreement, not top-down imposition.
And that shift in perspective itself, demanding voluntarism, can be empowering personally, even if a fully stateless society isn't right around the corner.
That's the idea presented, yes. It changes how you interact with the world.
So we've covered a huge amount from these Practical Anarchy excerpts. We looked at that core critique. The state initiating force is wrong. We explored all these proposed voluntary alternatives for defense, for disputes via DROs and CRAs, for handling pollution, roads, healthcare, money.
And how the source tries to counter those common objections about crime or monopolies or dictators, usually by pointing to economic disincentives and the principles of voluntary interaction instead of state coercion.
The central thread throughout is definitely that the state's reliance on initiating force is the fundamental problem, and that voluntary approaches are presented as both morally right and practically superior.
It's certainly a challenging perspective that pushes you to question a lot of assumptions about how society has to be structured. The source offers these detailed, though maybe theoretical, mechanisms for how things could work differently.
And it keeps coming back to the individual and our own interactions. Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this deep dive. If the source is right, that the state's power relies on people accepting these one-sided, often coercive relationships, what happens if we individually start to consciously demand mutual value, real consent, and voluntary agreement in all our dealings, both personal and in how we engage with broader society?
Could that shift in individual perspective, that demand for voluntarism, actually start to change society itself, maybe bit by bit, moving it closer to the kind of voluntary model the source envisions?
A really interesting question to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Practical Anarchy.